Everyone at that ribbon-cutting ceremony clapped when my own daughter told the reporter she'd built her company from nothing but a laptop and a dream. Then, 20 minutes later, her assistant handed me an invoice for the catering table I was standing next to, calling me sir because he didn't recognize the man whose name was still on the building's mortgage. I looked at that invoice. I looked at my daughter across the room, laughing with a state senator. Then I folded it once, slid it into my jacket pocket, and walked out into the parking lot without saying a word to anyone. Nobody in that building that afternoon knew whose signature had made any of it possible. My name is Walter Higgins. I'm 63 years old. I spent 34 years as a machinist at a tool and die plant outside Akron, Ohio. The kind of job where you come home every night with metal shavings in the cuffs of your pants and a ringing in your ears that never fully goes away. I raised my daughter Melissa mostly by myself after her mother passed when Melissa was 11. I'm not a man people notice in a room. I drive a 15-year-old pickup, and I've worn the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation since before Melissa graduated high school. But I built more than anybody at that ribbon cutting ever understood, and that afternoon is where I finally stopped pretending I hadn't. Diane died in February when Melissa was 11. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed too late to do much about, gone within 4 months of the diagnosis. I don't like dwelling on that part, so I'll just say it plain. One day I had a wife, and then I didn't. And I had a daughter who needed somebody to braid her hair for school pictures and sit through every band concert in a gymnasium that smelled like floor wax. So, that's what I did. I worked the floor at Redline Tool and Die from 6 in the morning until my shift ended, and then I picked Melissa up from her grandmother's house and made dinner and helped with homework. I barely understood myself. Math I hadn't touched since my own school days. Money was tight in a way I never let Melissa see. I remember eating the same pot of chili for most of a week more than once, so she could have new shoes when the other kids started noticing the old ones. I never told her any of that. A father doesn't put that weight on a kid. I wanted her to grow up thinking things were steady, even on the weeks they weren't. She grew up watching me leave the house every morning in steel-toed boots with grease under my fingernails that never fully scrubbed out. And somewhere along the way, without me catching it happening, she started to feel a little ashamed of that. Kids don't always know how to tell the difference between a hard life and a small one. Melissa mixed the two up early, and I didn't notice how deep it had settled until it was already part of her. By the time she hit high school, she'd stopped bringing friends home. She said our house was too cramped for people to hang around in, but I think it had more to do with my truck parked in the driveway with the plant's logo still on the hard hat sitting on the dash, and the fact that I smelled like machine oil most evenings, no matter how long I showered. I never made an issue of it. Figured it was a phase kids grow out of once they understand what actually matters in a person. I was wrong about that. It would take me almost 20 years to find out how wrong. Melissa found her calling in computers, and it happened almost by accident, the way these things do. She got access to a school computer lab her sophomore year because a teacher noticed she had a knack for it, and within a few months she was staying after school building little programs just to see if she could. She'd come home talking about code and databases the way other kids talked about sports teams. I remember standing in the doorway of her room, watching her debug something at 11 at night, frustrated, starting over without giving up. I thought, this is the thing that's going to take her somewhere. I told her I'd support her no matter what it cost me. She got into a state university, 2 hours from home, computer science program, and I covered everything her scholarships didn't reach. I picked up overtime shifts, weekends, holidays, anything with a shift differential attached to it. I never let her see what that cost me in sleep or in my knees, which were already starting to go by then from 3 decades of standing on a concrete floor. When she graduated, she came home with a degree and an idea for a business, something about software that helped small manufacturing companies track their inventory in real time. She didn't want to work for somebody else for 10 years climbing a ladder. She wanted to build her own thing from day one. She was 24, no real credit history, no track record, and every bank in Akron and Cleveland turned her down flat when she tried to get a business loan on her own merit. That's when she came to me one night at my kitchen table, nervous in a way I hadn't seen from her since she was small, asking if I still had the house paid off. She needed collateral. She needed somebody with clean credit and equity in real property to put their name behind her, and there was exactly one person in her life who fit that description. I didn't think twice. I'd spent my whole working life building things out of steel and aluminum on a factory floor, and here was a chance to help my daughter build something out of ideas instead. I told her yes before she'd even finished asking, and I meant every bit of it. I had no idea that word would end up costing me more than the money ever could. I took out a home equity loan against the house on Larchmont Avenue, the same house I'd owned free and clear for 9 years after paying it off early doing side work on weekends. I co-signed a business line of credit for $850,000, a number that still makes my hands go a little cold when I think about it too directly. The bank wanted more than my signature on the guarantee, though. They wanted actual ownership stake tied to it, something with weight behind it if things went sideways. So a lawyer set up the company, with me holding 35%, quiet and on paper only, while Melissa held the rest and ran the day-to-day. Melissa asked me for one more thing that night, and looking back, that request should have told me everything I needed to hear if I'd let myself actually listen to it. She asked if we could keep my ownership stake out of the public story. She said investors liked a founder narrative, a young woman who'd built something from nothing through pure grit and talent. And having her machinist father listed as a 35% owner would complicate that story in front of people writing checks. She wanted people to believe she'd done every bit of it herself. I told myself it was just how business worked now, branding and image, the kind of thing young founders had to think about. I agreed to stay quiet about it. The company was called Meridian Track, and it operated out of a converted warehouse space in the Flats district of Cleveland with exposed beams and a wall of monitors Melissa had picked out herself. I stood near the back at the launch party, wearing the one blazer I owned, and watched my daughter shake hands with local tech reporters and small business owners like she'd been groomed for that room her whole life. Nobody introduced me as anything beyond a family friend who'd stopped by to show support. I told myself it didn't matter, that watching her succeed was payment enough on its own. For a long stretch of years, I actually believed that completely. I didn't understand yet how much a lie like that grows once you give it room to live in a house for years at a time. Meridian Track took off faster than either of us had let ourselves expect. Within 4 years, Melissa had landed contracts with 3 regional manufacturing chains and expanded into a second office space in Columbus. Business magazines started writing profiles on her, the self-made young woman who'd built a software company from a laptop and pure determination, no outside help, no family money behind her. Every article told some version of that exact story. And every time I read one, I noticed my name wasn't anywhere in it. Not even a passing mention of a father who'd remortgaged his house to make any of it possible. I told myself it was fine. I told myself a great many things were fine during those years. It was around then that Melissa started dating Preston Callahan, whom she'd met at an investor mixer one of her contracts had connected her to. The Callahans were old Cleveland money, the kind of family with their name on a hospital wing and a lake house up near Chagrin Falls that had belonged to them since the 1960s. Preston's father, Harold Callahan, had built a private equity firm that made Melissa's 35% of a mid-sized software company look modest by comparison. Harold was the sort of man who valued self-reliance above nearly every other virtue a person could hold. Melissa slid into that world with an ease that surprised even me, wearing it like it had always belonged to her. When Melissa and Preston got engaged the following spring, there was a party at the Callahan Lake House, and I stood near the edge of the patio with a drink I barely touched while I watched her introduce me to Harold, simply as an old family friend who'd helped her out early on. Not her father, just a friend. I remember shaking Harold's hand, smiling, telling him it was a beautiful home, while something in my chest cracked quietly in a place I hadn't found words for yet. I told myself she had her reasons, that maybe it would shift once the engagement excitement settled. It never did. It only got worse from there, and I let it, because I still believed being needed in secret was better than not being needed at all. 4 years passed that way, with me showing up to holidays and birthdays as a background figure Melissa barely acknowledged in front of the Callahans, and me telling myself every single time that it was fine. Then in early autumn, Melissa called and invited me to the ribbon cutting for Meridian Track's new corporate headquarters, a full building purchase downtown that Harold Callahan himself had apparently helped broker as a favor to his future daughter-in-law. She said it mattered to her that I be there. And for the first time in a long while, I let myself feel a small flicker of hope that maybe something had shifted, that maybe this was the moment she'd finally say it out loud in front of people who mattered to her. I'd been on a job that whole week doing custom fabrication work for a restoration shop, favors I still picked up for extra cash even in retirement, and I hadn't had time to drive home and change before heading downtown. I showed up in my work jacket and boots, sawdust and metal dust still on my jeans, because I figured Melissa's invitation meant more to me than clothes ever could. I drove straight from the shop, tired and proud and genuinely excited to see my daughter standing in front of a building with her name on the lease. Walking up to the new headquarters, the building Melissa had built with my signature and my house sitting behind it as collateral, I felt a strange mix of pride and nerves, the same feeling I used to get walking her into her first day of school. Through the glass doors, I could see the reception area filled with catering tables, a small stage with a microphone, and the whole Callahan family standing near the front in tailored clothes, champagne glasses catching the afternoon light. I straightened my jacket as best I could, took a breath, and walked through the doors toward my daughter and whatever was waiting on the other side of them. The receptionist recognized me right away and waved me through without checking any list, since I'd been by the old office enough times over the years that most of the staff knew my face on sight. Walking into that reception area felt like stepping into a different world entirely. Soft lighting, expensive perfume, everyone dressed like they'd stepped out of a business magazine spread. Harold stood near the front in a dark suit, laughing at something a city council member had just said. Melissa spotted me first. I watched her face shift, the smile she'd been wearing for the cameras, sliding sideways into something tighter and more careful. She crossed the room toward me fast, almost stepping on the hem of her own dress, before I'd made it more than a few steps inside. "Dad," she said, low and quick, the words meant to stay contained between the two of us. "What are you doing here dressed like that?" I told her I'd come straight from the shop, that I hadn't had time to change, that I was sorry if my clothes weren't right for the room. She glanced back over her shoulder toward the Callahans, and I watched Preston's mother lean toward another woman and murmur something behind her hand, both of them glancing our way afterward. Harold was watching too, his face doing that particular unreadable thing rich men do when they're deciding whether something is worth their attention at all. Melissa's jaw tightened, and I could see her running some kind of calculation behind her eyes, weighing her father against the family she was marrying into, and I could tell exactly which side of that equation she was landing on before she opened her mouth again. Whatever warmth I'd walked in with started draining out of me right there, near the entrance. The whole week of work suddenly sitting heavy in my legs. Her voice came out sharper than I'd ever heard her use with me, loud enough to carry across the reception area. "Dad, this is a professional event for investors and the board. You can wait in the lobby outside." For a second, I just stood there, not fully processing the words, even though I'd heard every one of them clearly. Wait in the lobby outside. Like I was some stranger who'd wandered in off the sidewalk looking for a free drink. Like 22 years of raising her by myself counted for nothing next to how I looked standing near a stage in work boots. Somebody near the front laughed first, a short, surprised sound that broke the quiet, and then 2 or 3 more voices joined it. Not cruel exactly. More the careless kind of laughter people offer when they think a joke's been made at somebody else's expense and don't want to be the one who doesn't get it. Harold didn't laugh, but he didn't say anything either. Just watched with that same flat expression, comfortable enough in his own skin to let it play out without stepping in. I looked past Melissa at that whole gathered room, at Preston not quite meeting my eyes, at the ribbon strung across the front doors waiting to be cut, at a life-size cutout of Melissa's face that some marketing person had printed for the event. Nobody in that room knew that the walls around them, the offices upstairs, the servers running in the back, existed because I'd signed my house over to a bank 9 years earlier. Nobody knew, because Melissa had made very sure of that from the beginning. Standing near that entrance, I felt something shift inside me, quiet and cold and completely clear, not anger exactly, more like finally seeing something for precisely what it was. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice or make any kind of scene, because that's never been who I am. I just nodded once, slow, and started to turn back toward the doors, telling myself I'd sit in the truck until it was over, or maybe just drive home and let the whole thing go the way I'd let so many things go over the years. That's when Nadia, the office manager who'd worked for Melissa since the very first year in the flat's warehouse, and who'd seen me at more of these company gatherings than Melissa probably remembered, came around a catering table carrying a small clipboard. Out of pure habit, built over years of watching me quietly cover the catering deposit whenever Melissa was too buried in work to think about it. Nadia walked straight past Melissa and held the clipboard out toward me, near where I'd been standing. She didn't even glance up from it, just said the catering balance came to $1,400 whenever I had a moment, and turned to head back toward the kitchen staff, completely unaware of what had happened 30 seconds earlier in that room. I looked down at that invoice sitting in her hand, and something about it landed different than anything ever had before. $1,400 for an event I'd just been told to wait outside of, in a building that existed because of money and risk that had come entirely from me. I took the clipboard, looked at the number, signed nothing, and folded the paper once before sliding it into my jacket pocket, my eyes staying on Melissa the whole time I did it. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, but nothing came out. I turned, walked past the confused faces and the champagne glasses, out through the glass doors, past the reception desk, and out into the cold parking lot, leaving the ribbon-cutting scissors sitting untouched on their little velvet cushion. The drive home was quiet in a way I hadn't experienced before. Not angry quiet, something deeper and stiller than that. I didn't turn on the radio. I just drove through the early dark with my hands steady on the wheel, replaying the whole thing over and over. The laughter, Harold's unreadable face, Nadia holding out that clipboard without knowing what she'd just walked into. By the time I pulled into my driveway on Larchmont Avenue an hour later, something inside me had gone completely still, the way a pond goes still right before it starts to freeze over. I sat in my truck in the dark for a long while before going inside. I thought about Diane, gone all these years now, and how I'd never let myself fall apart in front of Melissa. How I'd swallowed every hard thing quietly so she'd never have to carry any of it herself. I thought about the home equity loan against this exact house. About co-signing an $850,000 line of credit while a loan officer, 20 years younger than me, explained the risk, like I hadn't already understood it completely on my own. I thought about being introduced as an old family friend at my own daughter's engagement party. Around 11 that night, I called Ray Bellamy, an old friend from my machinist union days who'd gone on to become a business attorney with almost 3 decades of experience handling exactly this kind of situation. Ray picked up on the second ring, voice rough with sleep, asking right away what was wrong, because I never called that late unless something actually was. I told him I needed to come by his office first thing in the morning, that I needed him to pull the paperwork on a company called Meridian Track Holdings, and that I needed to understand exactly what rights I still held as a 35% owner who'd just been told to wait outside his own daughter's headquarters. Ray's office sat above a hardware store downtown, the kind of place with worn carpet and diplomas that had gone yellow at the corners from decades on the wall. I sat across from him the next morning while he spread the Meridian Track paperwork across his desk, the same documents I'd signed 9 years earlier, without reading every clause as carefully as I probably should have. Ray read through it slowly, tapping certain pages, asking questions about exactly what had happened at the ribbon cutting, and I told him the whole thing without leaving anything out. He found what he was looking for about 15 minutes in, tapping a clause in the operating agreement with the cap of his pen. "Walter," he said, looking up over his reading glasses, "your personal guarantee on that credit line isn't permanent. It's tied to an annual renewal the bank requires because the collateral is your house, and it comes up again in 6 weeks. You've also got a buyout clause here, lets you force a valuation and either purchase the other partner's share or sell yours outright if certain conditions get triggered, including material misrepresentation of ownership to investors or the public," which sounds like exactly what's been happening in every one of those magazine profiles. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something settle into place inside my chest. I told Ray I wanted to withdraw my personal guarantee when the renewal came due, formally, in writing, through the proper channels. No shouting, no theatrics, just the plain legal mechanics of a man removing his name from something he never should have hidden behind in the first place. I also asked him to draft a letter invoking the buyout clause, giving Melissa the option to purchase my 35% at fair market value within 90 days, or the full ownership structure would be forced into public record through standard filing. Ray nodded slowly and told me he'd have everything ready within the week. For the first time since walking out of that lobby, I felt something close to calm. The renewal letter went out from the bank exactly on schedule, 6 weeks later, informing Meridian Track Holdings that the personal guarantee behind their $850,000 credit line would not be renewed under current terms, and that the company would need to secure new collateral or a new guarantor within 30 days to avoid the line being called for repayment in full. I found out later from Ray that Melissa's finance director called him directly the same afternoon the letter landed, walking through exactly whose signature had been holding the entire structure together since the beginning. Melissa had never actually sat down and studied those original loan documents closely. Not really. She'd signed where Ray and I told her to sign back when she was 24, and desperate to get the company off the ground, trusting that her father had handled the details the way I'd handled every detail of her life up to that point. Now, 9 years later, sitting across from her own finance director explaining that the entire financial foundation of Meridian Track rested on her father's house and her father's credit, Melissa was hearing the true shape of her own success story for the first time in her adult life. According to Ray, who'd taken a call from the bank's legal department confirming receipt of our buyout letter that same week, Melissa went pale in that meeting and asked to see the original documents pulled up on the screen in front of her. She sat there in silence for close to a full minute, staring at my signature on page after page, at the house on Larchmont listed as collateral, at the 35% ownership stake that had been sitting quietly in her father's name since before Meridian Track ever opened its doors. Whatever story she'd built about herself over 9 years, the self-made narrative she'd fed to reporters and future in-laws alike, was sitting right there in black and white, unraveling in front of her. Melissa called me 14 times over the next 2 days, and I let every single call go to voicemail. Not out of spite, but because I genuinely had nothing left to say that hadn't already been said standing near that stage. On the third day, she showed up at my house unannounced, standing on the porch where I'd stood so many times waiting for her to come home from school dances. Except now, the roles felt strange and reversed in a way neither of us was used to. She looked different than she had at the ribbon cutting. The polish worn thin, dark circles under her eyes, like she hadn't slept properly in days. "Dad," she said, "we need to talk about the bank letter, about the buyout thing your lawyer sent." I invited her in, made 2 cups of coffee the same way I always had, and sat across from her at the same kitchen table where she'd once asked me to put my house on the line to help her chase her dream. She asked why I was doing this now, after everything, after all the years I'd stayed quiet and let things be, however she needed them to be. I told her the truth, plain and steady, the way I'd learned to say hard things over a lifetime of not saying them soon enough. I told her I wasn't doing anything to her. I was just done doing something for her that she'd never once acknowledged out loud. Done being a silent partner in a life where I wasn't even allowed to stand in the room. I told her that pulling my guarantee wasn't revenge. It was just me finally treating my own name in my own house the way she taught me. She treated me as something to be used quietly and kept out of sight when convenient. She sat there a long time without answering, staring into her coffee, and for the first time in years, I watched my daughter actually run out of words. Word travels fast in circles like the Callahans, and within 2 weeks of that bank letter going out, Harold had heard the whole story, not from me, but from his own attorney, who'd caught wind of the credit situation through mutual contacts in Cleveland's business community. Harold called Melissa directly one evening and asked her point blank whether it was true that the entire Meridian Track operation had been built on her father's personal guarantee and a hidden ownership stake. The same father she'd introduced at her own engagement party as nothing more than an old family friend. I heard about that conversation secondhand weeks later through Preston, who called me one afternoon sounding shaken in a way I'd never heard from him before. He told me his father had always respected self-made success above almost anything else in this world, that it was practically the whole foundation of how the Callahan family measured a person's character, and that discovering Melissa's success had actually been quietly financed and guaranteed by a father she'd erased from the public. Story had shifted something permanently in how Harold viewed his future. Daughter-in-law. Preston said his father used the word disappointed, which apparently in that family carried more weight than anger ever could. Harold Callahan, I learned, had built his own firm from almost nothing after a rough stretch in his own family's finances decades earlier. And the one thing he could not tolerate above nearly any other flaw was a person who erased the people who'd actually made their success possible. Melissa had spent 9 years building an image of herself as exactly that kind of self-made woman, in front of exactly the kind of family who valued that story more than almost anything else. Now the whole foundation of that image had cracked open in front of the very people whose approval she'd been chasing the entire time. The new downtown headquarters, the same building where I'd been told to wait in the lobby, went back on the market within 5 months without my guarantee behind the loan, and without Melissa having built enough independent credit or capital reserves of her own after years of living as though her father's name would always quietly cover whatever gaps appeared. The bank called the line when she couldn't secure new collateral in time. The Columbus office closed 2 months after that, and only the original Flats warehouse space survived, scaled back and running with a skeleton crew. Preston didn't leave her, but something between them shifted permanently, the way he told it to me later. He said discovering the truth had made him look back at their whole relationship differently, wondering what else Melissa had let him believe that wasn't quite the complete story. Harold, according to Preston, pulled back significantly from the informal introductions and business favors he used to extend to Melissa freely, the kind of quiet advantages that come with marrying into a family like that, treating her now with a careful, watchful distance instead of the easy warmth he'd shown before. Melissa lost weight over those months, showed up to a few family gatherings looking smaller somehow, the confidence that used to fill a room replaced by something more careful and uncertain. I didn't take any pleasure in watching it happen, and I want to be honest about that, because I'd spent too many years loving that girl to feel good about any part of her life falling apart. But I also didn't step in to soften any of it, because for the first time in her adult life, Melissa was standing in front of consequences that belonged entirely to her, built from choices she'd made without me standing quietly behind her, covering the gaps. Melissa came back to Larchmont Avenue on a Sunday afternoon in early winter, parking on the street instead of the driveway like she used to, and knocked on the front door instead of just walking in the way she'd done her whole life growing up in that house. I opened the door and found her standing there in a plain coat, no polish left in how she carried herself, just a tired woman in her 30s who looked, for the first time in a long while, like she actually wanted to say something true. We sat at the kitchen table where she used to do her homework, and she talked for almost an hour without me interrupting once. She told me she'd been ashamed of where we came from since she was a kid, ashamed of the truck and the work boots and the small house, and that shame had turned into something uglier over the years. A need to erase the parts of her story that felt too plain for the world she wanted to belong to. She said she understood now that erasing me from that story meant erasing the only person who'd ever shown up for her without conditions attached. She said she was sorry in a way that didn't sound rehearsed, just plain and a little broken. I told her I appreciated hearing that, and that I believed her, but that things weren't going back to exactly how they'd been before that ribbon cutting. I told her if she wanted me in her life going forward, it would have to be as her father, out loud, in front of whoever happened to be standing in the room, not as a quiet arrangement she pulled out when it was useful and hid away when it wasn't. She nodded, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, she reached over and hugged me the way she used to as a kid, not performing anything for anyone, just two people at a kitchen table trying to find their way back to something honest. It's been almost a year now since that afternoon downtown, and things look different than they used to, though not in the way the magazines would have written it before. Melissa runs the one remaining office herself now, without my guarantee behind it, working the kind of long hours I used to work back when she was small, watching me leave the house before sunrise. She calls me most weeks now, actually calls, not just when something's needed. And last month, she introduced me to a new client at the office as her dad. Plain and simple, no old family friend, no careful editing of the truth. Harold and I have actually spoken a handful of times since everything settled, and I found him to be a more decent man than that first impression at the ribbon cutting suggested, the kind of person who respects someone more once he understands what they actually built with their own two hands. He told me once, over coffee Melissa had arranged awkwardly between the three of us, that he wished he'd known the real story years earlier, that a machinist who'd remortgaged his house for his daughter's dream deserved more respect at that event than most of the people who'd laughed that afternoon ever did. I still drive the same old truck. I still come home most days with grease under my nails from whatever job I'm picking up. But I sit at family tables now without wondering whether I actually belong there, because Melissa finally understands what it costs to build the life she has, and she stopped pretending that cost might belong to her alone. Sometimes I think back to standing near that stage, hearing my own daughter tell me to wait outside, and I realize that moment didn't destroy anything that was actually worth keeping. It just finally showed me, clear as anything, exactly what needed to change, and gave me the push I needed to change it.